I've always liked Dark Souls 2 ever since the first time I played it, but I was never really able to, until now, explain kind of why. Like what it was about the game I really liked. Because a lot of people dislike Dark Souls 2, and I can really understand why. It's kind of the odd one out of the franchise. Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 are very closely related in terms of lore, plot, similar characters, or some of the same characters appear in both games. Even the combat and the gameplay mechanics are a lot similar. So I kind of found that when Dark Souls 3 came out, Dark Souls 2, which had already kind of been a bit of an odd game, kind of really got shunted down, and people tended to get a more and more negative view about it. And I can kind of see why. I mean, there's a lot of things that are just really strange in Dark Souls 2. Like, you don't have the really well designed world. Like, all the different areas feel like they're very compartmentalized and they're just kind of totally different times and places. Whereas in Dark Souls 1 and 3, you can see the other levels off in the distance, and the sense of scale works pretty good, and there's a lot of like shortcuts and stuff. That just isn't really a thing in Dark Souls 2. While the lore and plot of all the Souls games is kind of confusing, in 1 and 3, you have the whole Age of Gods. Like, the intro to Dark Souls 1 gives you a very good framing device that you can kind of put everything in to the context of how do things relate to the gods, how do things relate to the four great souls, that kind of thing. But you don't really have as much of a framing thing in Dark Souls 2. You have something about King Vendrick, and then you just have all of these kind of like side stories, and none of them seem particularly deep or really related to one another. And it always kind of bothered me because it was just like, what is the point of all of this? Does this like fit together somehow? Because in 1 and 3, things do kind of fit together. Even if you have to fill in a lot of blanks, it's clear everything takes place in the same world. In Dark Souls 2, it feels like nothing takes place in the same world. And I mean, the gameplay is very different as well, but let's not really go into that. That's kind of a different matter. So, why do I like it? Despite kind of these issues. I'm kind of inconsistent when it comes to things that are very abstract, because sometimes I really hate them. Like, I generally don't like art movies, but sometimes you'll have something that's very existentialist and subtle and that kind of thing, and I really like it. A good example of that is the endings to Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, where all the endings are kind of abstract, particularly the wish endings. Because some of them are really weird, like, I want the zone to disappear, and then your character goes blind, or humanity is corrupt, it must be controlled, and you're left in a void with no people. And I really kind of like really abstract, kind of existentialist stuff like that. And I feel Dark Souls 2 is by far the most kind of existentialist and abstract of the three, where it really, really de-emphasizes the story even more so than the other two games are, and the lore, in favor of, and that was kind of the issue, is what is it de-emphasizing in favor of? What are they kind of replacing the aspects of the previous two games with? And something that FromSoft is very good at, better than just about any company, is mixing gameplay together with themes and story. Like, a lot of the things that happen in the Souls games are directly like the gameplay and story are very well integrated together. It can kind of be a bit hard to explain, but the game's very good at limiting what you're told, creating a certain environment where you're kind of pushed in a certain way. Like in Dark Souls 1, you're told to go to Anor Londo, that you're the chosen undead, etc. And then as you're going there, the game world really isn't telling you anything other than that's the place you have to go. And it's very much the gameplay kind of reinforces that, and then it's only really later that it's kind of revealed to you, and then you kind of go back and start seeing where all these like holes were and stuff like that. It's hard to describe. I think you kind of have to just play one of them for yourself to kind of get what I'm trying to say. But in Dark Souls 2, I think the lack of kind of a coherent overriding narrative is kind of a design choice. It's kind of a feature rather than a bug. Because if you look at how the game starts, your character has forgotten everything about his past. He's forgotten absolutely everything about who he is, what he was, and he goes to Drangleic in search of a cure to kind of get his past back, to get his memories back, to become a whole person again. And there's kind of a concept I have called coming in from the cold, which is where you're like a broken, desolate, kind of purposeless person, and you kind of have to go through a process of, like I said, coming in from the cold, coming out of the kind of the misery, the freezing misery, and kind of warming up and becoming a person again. And I kind of use that term. That was what I was going to name my Evangelion fanfic, actually. And it was going to be like about the characters in that coming in from their self-isolation, coming in from their self-hatred, and kind of becoming full people again. And so I kind of view the journey to Drangleic like that. Is you're a broken person with absolutely nothing, and rather than trying to save the world or anything kind of grand, at least initially, you come there just to kind of find a purpose, just to kind of figure out who you are. And so this kind of comes into how I think the game is, at least this is my interpretation, or how I felt when I played it. Dark Souls 2 feels a lot more, I don't know if hopeful's the right term than the other two games. It feels a lot less grim to me. Because, well, Dark Souls 1 is apocalyptic. Dark Souls 2 I like to think of as being not necessarily post-apocalyptic, but like post-apocalyptic. The impression I get at Majula, at least, is that the sun is rising. That the sun isn't setting, the first flame isn't dying, the world isn't kind of going into chaos. The destruction has happened. Like, there's been an age of dark, and I know Dark Souls 3 contradicts this. There's been an age of dark, and things are kind of re-emerging. Drangleic had fallen, all these other people had fallen, and it kind of feels to me like the various people are getting better. Majula has kind of an atmosphere to it that you don't really see anywhere else. It does kind of have this sense of camaraderie to it. You rescue all these various people and they go there, and you have them kind of try to build a life together. Kind of just trying to live like normal people in a way I don't really see in the other games. And like I said, it's not so much like in one where you're trying to prevent the world from dying, or in 3 where it's time to just let old things die. In 2, it feels like the death is over, it's time to start rebuilding. And I kind of feel that's kind of a metaphor for your character to a certain extent. They're absolutely nobody when they come here. They have no fate, no destiny. And as you go there, you start to kind of have your character go through all these experiences. I find you meet a lot more characters in Dark Souls 2, and they're a lot more kind of developed than they are in the other games. So you start kind of meeting all these people, you go through all these different stories, and you have all kind of these side adventures, and they're mostly kind of, I think, self-complete. Like, you have the love between the bells. You have like Mitha, who drank poison to try to make herself beautiful. You have the covetous demon who ate until he became that. And they're just kind of all these side little stories. And I kind of feel as you go through the game, your character who's empty is kind of being filled up. He's kind of being filled up by all these different experiences of all the kind of the relationships with the people. And as you're going through it, your character's kind of becoming a whole person again. Not necessarily in the way that he thought, perhaps, that you were going there to restore your past and to remove the curse from you, to kind of prevent hollowing, but in a sense I feel like you're preventing it in another way. Through kind of, like I said, the connections you make through people, through the challenges you overcome, through the wrongs you right, etc. You're kind of developing a personality again. You're coming in from the cold, as it were, and becoming a whole person. And while I'm pretty sure this wasn't the intention of the people who made the game, I always kind of felt the kind of message of Dark Souls 2 is the persistence of the self. That is, the world can fall apart, kingdoms rise and fall, etc., but the individual is eternal. Um, the soul exists forever because you have like the souls of the lords, and even though it's been eons, they still exist and they still kind of come back in their own way. And it says that, as they said, they still kind of exerts influence over the land. And I kind of feel that what the game is kind of ultimately about is accepting that light and dark exist and that there's going to be a cycle between them. But what ultimately matters is you as the individual, you as a person, the experiences you have, the bonds you forge with others, that sort of thing. Who the self is, more so than anything else. And that there's always going to be monsters, there's always going to be peace, there's always going to be happiness, there's always going to be sorrow, all these things. I remember in particular, I think the item description of Dull Ember really describes what the entire series is about, in particular what the message of this game is. An ember radiating a dull light. This flame seems nearly exhausted, but exhibits an eerie resilience. Perhaps this is its ordinary state. And I think that's kind of supposed to say that is what the natural state of humanity is. Is that it's a constant struggle, etc. You're constantly on the verge of going out, and that's just kind of the nature of the world. And there is this cycle that once the flame reaches the end, it'll ignite again. But kind of like I said, what's important is who you are. And as you kind of go through the game, as I said, I think your character gets better and better, and has kind of by the end of it sort of become himself fully. He doesn't necessarily regained his past, but he's been able to kind of construct a new identity for himself. And then we have the four crowns, Vendrick's crown, and then the Ivory King, the Iron King, and the Sunken King. Now, Vadi's interpretation of this, and I would tend to agree, is on one level, they're the four Lord Souls, obviously, and by uniting them within your person, you've more or less restored the world within yourself. The first flame has been restored. Balance has been returned. The cycle has more or less concluded, and you're beyond it now. And that's kind of the in-game explanation. That's kind of the lore explanation, etc. But as I said, I think what it's supposed to be is you've come in from the cold. You may not remember who you were, but you are a full person now. You've become human again, not by losing the curse, but like I said, by forging relationships with others, through life experiences, through finding meaning. Be that whatever that meaning is, you have to find your own answers. If that's taking the throne, if that's righting wrongs, if that's seeking power, your character has kind of at last found that and found a purpose in his life. And to me, kind of the most kind of profoundly beautiful moment, I think, in all of Dark Souls 2 is when you get all the crowns and you go to Vendrick and you get the blessing that makes you immune to the undead curse, immune to hollowing. He simply says, seek strength, the rest will follow. Which I think is just a very profound statement. It's just kind of saying, ultimately, there is no escape from this. There's always going to be all these things. All you can do is just try to be strong, try to be virtuous, try to be a good person, try to kind of remain true to who you are and what you are. That's ultimately all you can do. You can't change the fundamental nature of reality. You can only kind of be the strongest version of yourself that you can be. And to me, that's kind of represents what Vendrick, that was kind of the answer that he ultimately found, or at least found after you brought him the four crowns, that ultimately you cured the curse itself, more or less. Well, I suppose you're still immortal in the sense you can't die. You're no longer at risk of hollowing because you've become a whole person again. Um, and that complete sense of self, that soul is now beyond the cycle. You are kind of a complete self-sufficient being. What it kind of reminds me of is there's a Hindu philosophy, branch of philosophy. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Samkhya, Samkhya, which is a Indian philosophy that believes only two things exist: the self or consciousness and matter, and that all that ultimately exists and matters is the self. And to me, that's kind of the conclusion that your characters come to. That ultimately he is who he is. Um, his identity is not dependent upon the cycles of the world, but upon his own unchanging eternal essence and upon the experiences he's had that have kind of forged him into the person he is. So I'm sorry if that was a bit confused and kind of difficult. These are very kind of complicated concepts we're dealing with here, especially since we're dealing with a game that's notoriously vague in a series that's notoriously vague. But I hope you found that kind of interesting and it maybe gives you a bit more of a appreciation for Dark Souls 2.